Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. You're watching the news with your host Kriti Mishra. In the next 30 minutes, I'll take you through news from around the world. First, the headlines this Friday evening. Russian forces encircle Ukraine's capital Kiev. Kremlin signals readiness for talks. Prime Minister Modi raises issues of safety of Indians with Putin. Many countries come forward to help Ukraine. UN announces $20 million aid. Markets rebound after sanctions on Russia. Crude oil prices cross $100 per barrel. Prime Minister Modi emphasizes self-reliance in defence, highlights increase in exports by 6 times in last 5 or 6 years. And campaigning ends for the 5th phase in Uttar Pradesh, voting on Sunday for 61 assembly seats in 12 districts. And in our top story, even as Ukraine is preparing for a Russian assault on its capital, the Kremlin spokesperson said Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to send a delegation of high-ranking officials to hold talks with Kiev. Meanwhile, the UN's refugee agency says about 1 lakh Ukrainians have been displaced in the invasion by Russia. Russia is preparing ahead its invasion of Ukraine, bringing it to the outskirts of capital city of Kiev on Friday. Airstrikes on Ukrainian cities and military bases continued as troops and tanks moved in from 3 sides to attack Kiev. Reports said Russian mechanized forces from Belarus were about 20 miles away. Western leaders scheduled an emergency meeting as Ukraine's president pleaded for international help. Ukrainian President Zelensky said subversive groups were encircling the city. The US said Kiev would be under siege. Ukraine also said it had lost control of the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Civilians piled into trains and cars to flee, and patrons of a hotel were directed to a shelter as explosives were heard in Kiev. According to the Ukraine president, 137 heroes, including 10 military officers, had been killed and 316 people wounded. They included 13 border guards in the Black Sea island that Russia claimed it has captured. Fearing a Russian attack, thousands of people went underground as night fell, jamming Kiev's subway stations. Zelensky has told global leaders that if they don't help now, tomorrow the war will knock on other nations' door. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. And the UN has also announced a $20 million humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the United Nations and its allies are committed to assisting people in Ukraine in this time of need.
Today, I'm announcing that we'll immediately allocate $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to meet urgent needs. We and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering to support people in Ukraine at their time of need. United Nations staff are working on both sides of the contact line, always guided by the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity and independence. We are providing life-saving humanitarian relief to people in need, regardless of who or where they are.
And head of UN Humanitarian Operations, Martin Griffiths, said the UN will help emergency operations and provide healthcare, shelter and food to those affected by the conflict. And moving on, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke on phone yesterday with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the developments in Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi reiterated his long-standing conviction that the differences between Russia and the NATO group can only be resolved through honest and sincere dialogue. He also appealed for an immediate end to the violence and called for efforts from all sides to return to diplomatic negotiations. Prime Minister Modi also sensitized the Russian president about India's concerns regarding the safety of Indian citizens in Ukraine, especially students. He also conveyed that India attaches the highest priority to their safe return to India. Both leaders agreed that their officials and diplomatic teams will maintain regular contacts on the issue of topical interests. And US President Joe Biden has warned that countries supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine will face a strong backlash. He also told Russia that its relation with America will end if the present events continue. Biden asserted that Putin's aggression against Ukraine will result in massive economic and strategic damage to Russia.
Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine, and may God protect our troops.
And with Ukraine closing down its airspace, the External Affairs Ministry is sending teams to the land borders in Hungary, Poland, Slovak Republic and Romania to assist evacuation of Indian nationals stranded in the country. Ukraine shares its western borders with these countries while Russia is attacking from the eastern side. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar tweeted that he spoke to his counterparts in these 4 countries. Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla said Indian Air Force aircraft will also be pressed into service for evacuation if needed. An estimated 20,000 Indians are in Ukraine. About 4,000 managed to leave the country in the last few weeks. And we'll have more on Ukraine and Russia conflict in our World News segment. But for now, let's move on to business and economy. After Thursday's massive fall, there was a sign of recovery in almost all the Asian markets. Taking a cue from American indices, stock markets across Asia opened high and remained in positive territory. However, the gains could not compensate the previous loss, indicating weak sentiment. At the end of the trade, Japanese Nikkei was around 2%. Singapore's Straits Times gained around 0.5%, and Korea's Kospi was up by 1%. However, Hong Kong's Hang Seng remained in the negative territory and ended the trade with 0.5% loss. Indian markets too tried to regain some of the lost ground. The gains were widespread. Broader indices like mid-cap and small caps gained smartly. At the end of the trade, BSE Sensex gained 1,328 points or 2.4%. At the end of the session, it was at 55,858 levels. And SE Nifty 50 gained 2.5% or 410,000 points and ended the day at 16,658. The European Union says that it will be putting together the strongest and harshest package of sanctions it ever had considered in response to Russia's attack on Ukraine.
European Union leaders put on a united front early on Friday after a 6-hour meeting during which they agreed on a second package of economic and financial sanctions against Russia. Legal texts for the sanctions were expected to be finalized overnight and to be submitted for approval to EU Foreign Affairs ministers. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Ukraine's invasion put into question Europe's peace order and said the EU will hold Kremlin accountable for its actions, saying sanctions will have a maximum impact on Russian elite.
There will be more economically damaging sanctions that extend the kind of sanctions regime beyond what we have seen so far, which has mainly been to target the Russian elite or oligarchs or, parts of the defense establishment. But these next sanctions will be more broad-ranging and a promise to target kind of a broader footprint of the economy, and therefore will affect ordinary Russians to a much greater extent than we have seen so far.
The European Union package, decided in concert with Western allies, includes targeting 70% of the Russian banking market and key state-owned companies, including in defense. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Now news from the poll-bound states. And in election news, on the last day of campaigning for the 5th phase in Uttar Pradesh, Home Minister Amit Shah addressed election rallies in Kaushambi, Prayagraj and Pratapgarh. He said a strong government is needed to preserve the integrity of the country. He targeted the Samajwadi Party, saying it is focused on accumulating wealth and nepotism. Congress leader Rahul Gandhi and Party General Secretary Priyanka Gandhi Vadra together addressed a rally in Amethi. Rahul criticized the BJP government on the issues of inflation, farmers and women. He said that the centre and the state had done nothing on the job front. Samajwadi Party President Akhilesh Yadav campaigned in Ayodhya. He said the BJP is making false claims on development. He asserted that the SP will ensure all-round development of Uttar Pradesh. Bahujan Samaj Party Chief Mayawati said issues like inflation, poverty and unemployment will decide the Uttar Pradesh elections. She claimed that the BSP alone is raising issues of public importance. Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath addressed a rally in Prayagraj. He reiterated his government's promise of providing a job to at least one member of each family. And Congress General Secretary Priyanka Gandhi Vadra held a roadshow in Prayagraj in support of party candidate Anugrah Narayan Singh. Thousands of party workers were present in the roadshow. Also, Samajwadi Party MP Jaya Bachchan campaigned for her party's candidate in Sirathu. She accused the BJP of lying while claiming that the party has always fought for the safety of women. And moving on, addressing a post-budget webinar of the Defence Ministry on Friday, Prime Minister Modi said that cybersecurity is no longer limited to just the digital world, but rather it is now a matter of national security. He also noted that the process of importing defence items is so long that by the time they reach our security forces, many become outdated. He emphasised that the solution is to go for indigenous manufacturing. He also asserted that weapons made in India had played a big role in World War II as well.
इस साल के बजट में देश के भीतर ही रिसर्च, डिजाइन और डेवलपमेंट से लेकर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग तक का एक वाइब्रेंट इकोसिस्टम विकसित करने का ब्लूप्रिंट है.
And in news from across the states. The budget session of Jharkhand Legislative Assembly got underway with the address of the governor. The state government will present its general budget for the coming financial year on 3rd of March. The assembly session will continue till 25th of March. The Supreme Court refused to hear the petition filed by BJP leader Suvendu Adhikari against an order of the West Bengal Assembly Speaker. The Speaker had rejected his plea to disqualify Mukul Roy as an MLA under the Anti-Defection Act. Vice President M. Naidu will be on a 2-day visit to Goa from 3rd of March. He will inaugurate the Darbar Hall of the Raj Bhavan. In Delhi, a blood donation camp was organized at AIIMS. BSF jawans donated blood. The BSF IG said that more than 200 BSF officers and other people have donated blood. BSF organizes such blood donation camps regularly. The Maharashtra Income Tax Department conducted searches on Friday at the residence of Shiv Sena councillor and BMC's Standing Committee Chairman Yashwant Yadav in Mumbai. The National War Memorial in New Delhi is celebrating its 3rd anniversary. It was dedicated to the nation in 2019 as testimony to the sacrifices made by the brave soldiers since independence. Chiefs of 3 wings of armed forces paid tributes. Time for a short break, but on the other side, protests sweep the world against the Russian invasion in Ukraine.
One country that will be closely watching the unfolding developments in Ukraine is China.
Global regional instability in Europe is always a welcome diversion for China.
What are the stakes for India in this conflict?
As the conflict and standoff has escalated, the stakes for India have only been rising. We will have to move with utmost caution, not to create a bad precedence under law and to balance the equation with both the strategic partners.
Welcome back. Let's go over to our flash news segment. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman holds discussion on credit-related issues with representatives from travel, tourism and hospitality sectors. After several days of questioning, CBI arrests Anand Subramaniam, former Group Operating Officer of NSC. India focusing on creating skilled manpower to be $5 trillion economy, says Health Minister Mansukh Mandavia at Industry Connect Meet. President Ramnath Kovind arrives in Guwahati on 3-day visit, will inaugurate 400th birth anniversary of a Home General, Lachit Borphukan. Supreme Court turns down BJP petition on deployment of paramilitary forces in West Bengal's urban civic polls. 3-judge bench of Karnataka High Court concludes hearing on hijab controversy, reserves judgment. 2 terrorists killed in an encounter with security forces in Jammu and Kashmir's Shopia district. Delhi Disaster Management Authority to remove all COVID restrictions, including night curfew. All schools to open from 1st of April. National War Memorial celebrates 3rd anniversary. Chiefs of 3 armed forces pay tributes. Daniil Medvedev becomes #1 after Djokovic loses quarter-final match at the Dubai Tennis Championship. And moving on, Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla, on a visit to the United Arab Emirates, called on Minister of Tolerance and Coexistence Sheikh bin Mubarak on Thursday. The Lok Sabha Speaker reiterated that India is a peace-loving nation and respects all religions. Both leaders agreed to further strengthen the time-tested relations between India and UAE. They also shared their commitment to expand the ties to untapped areas like energy, education, health and technology. And Rajya Sabha Chairman M. Venkaiah Naidu nominated Rajya Sabha member of the BJP Indu Bala Goswami to the Board of Governors of the National Institute of Fashion Technology, or NIFT. The Board of Governors is composed of key officials and experts from different areas. Members of Parliament, Ministry or Department, industry experts broadly make the Board of NIFT. The board is responsible for supervising, steering and providing direction to the institution. Now the news from across the world. Anti-war protests broke out over in at least a dozen cities in Russia. Local police detained more than 700 people. In Moscow, around 2,000 people gathered near the Pushkin Square, while up to 1,000 people gathered in St. Petersburg, according to AFP correspondents. A number of Russian activists called on social media for people to take to the streets after Putin launched an offensive on Ukraine in the early hours of Thursday. In Moscow, protesters were seen massing around Pushkin Square, chanting "No to war." Some of them said they were in a state of shock since most of their relatives live in Ukraine. Jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny reportedly said that he's against the war. Navalny, who used to mobilize Russia's largest protests against Putin, is serving a 2.5-year sentence outside Moscow. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. An anti-Russia protest roiled many nations across the world. Protesters in New Zealand and Australia condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over 100 people waved flags, carried placards and shouted anti-Russian slogans in Sydney. The protesters were demanding more action from the Australian government against Russia. A Ukrainian church service was also held in Western Sydney. Downing Street in London was also lit up in the colours of blue and yellow as a symbolic gesture of support for Ukraine. Other illuminations in the colours of the Ukrainian flag were seen across the globe, including Australia, France and Germany, as a sign of solidarity with the Ukrainian people. In New York, a projection artist projected "Stand with Ukraine" and the country's flag on a wall of the UN headquarters. In Hungary, several thousand demonstrators gathered in Budapest in front of the Russian embassy to denounce the invasion. Waving the flags of Ukraine and the European Union, protesters chanted for peace and an end to the Russian attacks. They demanded that Hungarian Prime Minister pull his country out of its business dealings with Russia. In Paris, about 1,000 people gathered to demand a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Several political parties and non-governmental organizations had called for the gathering, with the Ukrainian, Georgian and EU flags carried by the protesters. Many said the issue is not only about Russia's taking over the territories, but the entire Ukraine. In Portugal, protesters gathered in the cities of Lisbon, Porto and Faro and chanted anti-Putin slogans and sang traditional Ukrainian songs. Many broke down, saying that Ukraine can fight only for a few days and doesn't have as many arms as Russia. In Italy, members of Ukrainian community and several political parties demonstrated in front of the Russian embassy in Rome. Many protesters who had relatives still in Ukraine voiced their fear and anger. They said Ukrainian people are peaceful and they want peace, and sang the Ukrainian army anthem. And in news from across the world. Protesters in Nepal clashed with the police outside the legislature in Kathmandu, demonstrating against a contentious $500 million aid grant from the United States. Hundreds of protesters chanted slogans, pelted stones and pieces of glass and pushed through police barricades. Riot police responded by firing tear gas and water cannons. Several people were injured on both sides. Opposition to the aid grant comes mainly from the communist parties that are part of the coalition government. Los Angeles County allowed people to remove their masks while indoors if they are vaccinated. California's most populous county said it will relax its public health order on Friday to allow unmasking at restaurants, bars and other businesses for people who show proof of vaccination. Unvaccinated customers must continue to wear masks indoors. The move comes as the county's COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations have reduced drastically. Thousands of people marched in Sudanese capital to call for fully civilian government to lead the country's transition to democratic rule. Security forces used tear gas to disperse the demonstrators. An October military coup plunged the country into turmoil and triggered nearly daily street protests. Authorities have launched a major crackdown on the protesters. Senior Iranian officials say that the speedy achievement of an agreement in the Vienna negotiations on the restoration of a 2015 nuclear deal hinges on the West. Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council said the final stage of the talks in Vienna will not take place unless the West takes the political decision to resolve the remaining crucial issues needed for a balanced deal. An action from the world of sports in our sports segment. And let's start with tennis today. Russian Daniil Medvedev will be world #1 tennis player, with Novak Djokovic losing his quarterfinals at the Dubai duty-free tournament. He's assured to become the 27th man to hold the top ATP ranking when it is released next Monday. Had Djokovic won the Dubai tournament, Medvedev would have had to make it to the finals of the Mexican Open. He will be third Russian to hold the #1 ranking. Meanwhile, Rafael Nadal was made for a quarterfinal victory over Tommy Paul. The 6-0, 7-6 win sets up rematch with Daniil Medvedev after the Spaniard's 5-set Australian Open final comeback earned him a record-breaking 21st Grand Slam title. And let's move to cricket now. Ishan Kishan and Shreyas Iyer thrashed the Sri Lankan attack. Their half-centuries helped India to a 62-run win and a 1-0 lead in the 3-match T20 series. Kishan was headed for a century when he holed out in the 17th over for 89 of 56 balls. Iyer's unbeaten 57 of 28 balls took India's total to 199 for 2, which proved well beyond Sri Lanka. The visitors could only reach 137 for 6. Cyril Irvine scored his first Test century in his second match. He also shared the best opening partnership for South Africa since December 2020 in the second Test. South Africa were 238 for 3 at stumps on day 1 against New Zealand after losing the first Test within 3 days at the same venue. And before we close the bulletin, a relook at the headlines. Russian forces encircle Ukraine's capital Kiev. Kremlin signals readiness for talks. Prime Minister Modi raises issue of safety of Indians with Putin. Many countries come forward to help Ukraine. UN announces $20 million aid. Markets rebound after sanctions on Russia. Crude oil prices cross $100 per barrel. Prime Minister Modi emphasizes self-reliance in defence, highlights increase in exports by 6 times in last 5 or 6 years. And campaigning ends for the 5th phase in Uttar Pradesh, voting on Sunday for 61 assembly seats in 12 districts. Well, that's all we had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Namaskar.